Jung is a heavy influence. I think Jung, more than anyone, did the inner work of really understanding how transformation happens. He talked about the encounter with the numinous as being central to true transformation. Just sort of the encounter with the thing that's bigger than ourselves, the sense of transcendence. And he also talked about the anima and the animus, the inner masculine and the inner feminine, which is something that which informs our work and is something that certainly seems to be a reality in all of the work that we've done. Jordan Peterson is obviously hugely influenced by Jung. Jung is like his probably the most direct influence in what he's been saying, despite the fact that as Jung is still kind of outside the mainstream academic canon, he was told by people not to talk about Jung, that it would destroy his academic career if he talked about Jung. So he's continued to do that despite that. What I found when I first discovered Jordan Peterson last year was everything he was saying mapped onto everything that I had learnt the hard way over 12 years of personal growth. Integration of the shadow. It also framed this idea of becoming more aligned with the logos, like the idea of spoken truth, which I think is very central to what all of the stuff that we're doing is. Even the idea of vulnerability, it's like we're telling our deepest truth about how we feel. And there is a transformational part to that. And that's what I think he really points to, is the necessity of really speaking your truth, because by speaking our truth, we transform ourselves. And that, I think, that's central to all the religious traditions. In the beginning was the Word. There is something very central about speaking our truth. And in some sense, I feel like we speak ourselves into being. These are the kind of creatures that we are. And I think that's related to the power of intention. I think it's related to the power of, we are intention. Life is intention. We are forming ourselves in the world through our words and through our intentions. And a word is a kind of focused intention. So he provided the framework that made complete sense. And he even talks about it in his lectures. He says, people come up to me and say, you've just told me something that I feel that I already know. And he's like, yes, that's what archetypal stories do. You hear it and it goes... And so he says, I don't take personal responsibility for that. I'm speaking archetypal stories. And the reason they are archetypal stories, the reason they are the myths that we never forget in our culture and underpin our entire culture, is because they are true. That's why they exist. And so interpreting them and making sense of them is invaluable. So that's what I'd say. It's been a really powerful process listening to him and then really feeling that it grounds the stuff that I know on a much deeper level and connects it to this hugely deep story of Western culture, of the Logos, which even predates Christianity. I mean, it's an ancient tradition of speaking the truth and becoming more embodied in the world.
I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody conversation. What are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility, because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You know, you're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look at, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. And that's I've seen that phenomenon because I've been talking about this mythological material for a long time. And I can see when I'm watching crowds, people, their eyebrows lift, their eyes light up because I put something together for them. And that's what mythological stories do. So I'm not taking responsibility for that. That's what the stories do. So I say the story and people go click, 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 you know, and their eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable.
Jordan Peterson has obviously become quite a controversial figure, which has been quite difficult for me to see because I think he's consistently misinterpreted. And I think also that the political level is not the right level to appreciate him from. Like his analysis of mythology goes far deeper than the political manifestations of it. But I think his critique of postmodernism, and we can kind of, or the ideology of postmodernism, there's some truth in that. It's like, as you just said, the idea of we have a world that can easily slip into only seeing male authority as tyrannical and has no appreciation for that we all have dark sides. I mean, we're shortly to start running women's workshops, and like I'm very keen in our men's workshops to talk about the male shadow, to talk about owning our aggression, owning the kind of slightly predatory nature that can come in kind of male sexuality, owning those things, admitting they're there, and then they're not leaking out sideways, which is how these things often do. It's like if you deny that you have these aspects, they're going to play out in some way. And I have some my amazing female facilitators working on the female shadow, and it's something that you can't really even talk about. We did an interview with this woman, Louise Mazzanti, and put it out, and I've seen some of the emails that she's had for it from people, men and women, saying, thank God no one has ever spoken about this. I've been, in my 40 years of life, no one has ever talked about the female shadow. And it's something that is very difficult as a man to talk about, which is why I want to empower people like Louise to talk about it. Because it's very difficult to be misinterpreted, and it's a conversation that is almost certain to degenerate when you have it. So I wouldn't kind of go deeply into it, just to say that there is this, if we're going to talk about toxic masculinity, and I think people have a reaction to that. A lot of men say, well, why are you talking about toxic masculinity? It doesn't exist. It's like, well, toxic masculinity, we all have toxicity. We all have a dark side. And so toxic masculinity is kind of pointing to that dark side in men. It's like, yes, I fully accept that we all have a dark side. But it's like, okay, so what is toxic femininity? And the fact that it feels and is so difficult to have that conversation shows immediately that there is a gap. There is a gap. There is a kind of, it feels unsafe to have that conversation, which suggests that something is present in the culture that means there are certain things that you can say and certain things that you can't say. And that's the difficulty. That, I think, is what Jordan Peterson is pointing towards. And I don't think it's sustainable. I think that, especially since the election of Trump, what we've had is a reaction against this sort of liberal worldview that has an inclusivity that actually has a hidden shadow of exclusivity. It's like we're completely inclusive to everybody who thinks the same as we do, apart from all of these racists and homophobes, and there's this rejection of the Trump voters, there's this rejection of the Brexit voters, there's this sort of hidden superiority in liberalism that has created this massive political reaction. And it's like, if you're going, and this is where it ties into the inner work as well, it's like, we need to talk about the shadow of liberalism, because it's already created what for most liberals would consider the worst kind of political repercussions in their lifetime. It's created Brexit, it's created Trump. And so this is also part of rebel wisdom, is sort of saying, we need to talk about the shadow on the political level. We need to talk about the shadow on the cultural level. We need to say that there are reasons why this is happening. And a lot of it is because of this unintegrated shadow on the cultural level. If we don't integrate it, we're going to have more of the same. We're going to have more authoritarianism. We're going to have more reactions. We're going to have it, and that's where it links into the political dimension for me.